Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed.
Hey everyone, Geoff Pallay here, back for our monthly series on statewide ballot measures. They can't get rid of me totally from the show. Looking forward to chatting with Victoria today, the original host of On the Ballot, and we're going to talk about historical ballot measures. We do this once a month. Today we've got North Carolina. Should be a fun one. Stay close and near and dear to where I live here in South Carolina. So, Victoria, welcome back. Good to see you.
Happy to be back. Happy to be talking to you today, Geoff. This comes out next week, I believe, but this week we're actually celebrating Geoff's 15 years at Ballotpedia. So happy 15 years,
Thank
Geoff.
you. Yes. 15 years of Ballotpedia. It has been a journey, a ride. Our
Many
dog is
hats
still
worn.
alive, so she started with our family right when I started here, so I always feel like I attached her length to my length here, and yeah.
So in dog years, how many years has it been?
I think it's like 100 years, right? Yeah. No, it's been great. Everyone at Ballotpedia, y'all are wonderful to work with. So, yeah, 15 years.
15
Well,
years.
it's summer. It's longer days. So, what better time to talk about ballot measures than when sun's up till 9 and it's hot out. So
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited to talk about North Carolina.
Yeah, I know. Well, let's do it then. So, North Carolina, one of the longest running states with ballot measures. They've had 202 ballot measures since 1835. A lot of them passed. 73% have passed, 147 of those, 55 failed, which seemed to me like that's a higher pass rate than normal, but you know this better than I do. So what does that pass rate look like? How does that compare?
Yeah, sure. So we're still working our way, through the 50 states. So I can't say with definitive confidence how this compares nationally, but just from my experience working on historical ballot measures and statewide ballot measures in general, this seems right on track with other legislatively states that only have legislative referrals.
Right.
That's 70%. It's relatively high, like you said, which makes sense because legislators are putting these things on the ballot and voters are electing their legislators. So how does it compare to initiative states? States that have citizens who put petitions and ballot initiatives on the ballot. Those rates are around 50%. So it's a little bit less. Those topics tend to be a little bit more divisive. So yeah, definitely higher than initiative states. Another kind of notable statistic I found in North Carolina was there were 7 decades from the 1835 year that had 100% approval rating. Or 100% approval rate. Granted, the average number per decade was only 11, which is not very high, even for a legislative referral state. So like here in Texas, the average per decade was 40 as compared to that 11
They're
number.
going to have
And
17
states,
this year, so yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's definitely rising. Whereas like a state like California, which we've completed, has over 100 per decade, and they have the initiative process.
Yeah, I think so. What I'm hearing from that sort of summary is in a state like North Carolina, you get a good representation that legislators don't typically put something on the ballot unless they're pretty confident it's going to pass. And that's what usually leads to something like a high 70s approval rating.
Right.
Right.
Or they put it on the ballot because the Constitution requires it to go through that way, like to have
Right.
the Constitution amendment if they want to achieve like a certain policy.
Yeah. So the legislature refers nearly everything to the ballot with the exception of questions that are referred to the ballot by a constitutional convention. So what's the process like in North Carolina for legislative referrals? How does that work, and how does that compare to other states?
Yeah, so North Carolina has a 60% supermajority requirement in one legislative session. There are 9 other states that have that same requirement of 60%. 18 states require a 2/3 supermajority, so 66.7%. And then there's another 7 states that also require a supermajority, but in 2 legislative sessions. So it's somewhere between not as easy as a simple majority. 60% is obviously a higher threshold, but
Right.
not the highest threshold of these 2/3 supermajorities. The state constitution also requires bond measures to go before voters, but that's only a simple majority by the state legislature to put it on the ballot.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, right, those ballot referral processes really depend on the state. Like, take a state like Massachusetts or a state like North Dakota. In both of those states, which are heavily run by one party, a 2/3 majority is like not really that big a deal. But in states that are a little more purple, whether it's a 60 or 66% is the difference between something getting on the ballot and something not getting on the ballot. So very
Yeah.
interesting.
Not to get too far off the topic, but since we were just talking about Texas, Texas also has a 2/3 majority vote.
Yep.
And obviously it's not a very purple state, but was still able to put 17 amendments on the ballot this
Yeah.
year. So kind of interesting.
Although it all depends on how you look at it, right? I mean, I remember, speaking of 15 years of Ballotpedia, when I first started Ballotpedia, the state house election in 2010 was very contentious in Texas because it was like 77 to 73 in the chamber. It was very close. It was not a super polarized state house chamber. And of course, if we really want to get in the weeds on Texas, we could talk all about the way they elect their speaker and the history of those battles, but that is for a different episode. We're here to talk about ballot measures in North Carolina today. So let's talk about citizen initiatives. So as a reminder for our listeners and viewers, it's not just initiatives. It's just also about legislative for ballot measures, but North Carolina does not have the initiative. So tell us a little about, why not, and is there any history behind that at all, Victoria?
Yeah, so North Carolina has never voted on a constitutional amendment to authorize ballot initiatives. The state legislature would have had to refer that to the ballot, and they have never voted to do so. I don't have any statistics on hand if they've ever considered it. I think it gets introduced pretty often now in modern times, but never makes its way very far in the legislative process.
Yeah.
If you look at our map of states that have the ballot initiative process, especially in the South, with the exception of Arkansas and Florida, which have initiated constitutional amendments, there are not many states with the initiative process in the South. South Dakota was the first state to adopt the ballot initiative process in 1898, and it kind of just stayed in the West and Midwest. There are some, obviously, Massachusetts has the initiative process, but it wasn't really ever adopted in the South.
Yeah. We've got an article on Ballotpedia about this, about all the old votes. Some states have tried to create the initiative and didn't. States like Wisconsin, I think states like Texas, they had a
Texas,
vote
yeah,
once.
they voted on 1915.
But a lot of states outside of the initial states that got momentum in the early 20th century really never really quite adopted it. And it sounds like North Carolina is one of those.
Right.
They do have local initiatives, right? That's what you're saying?
Yeah. The state allows local governments to put initiatives on the ballot about certain subjects. They've had this since 1917. It's not in the Constitution, but they passed a state law that year to authorize local governments to do
And
so.
we really haven't seen states add the initiative in recent years because, it's much like in today's sort of political climate, I can't really imagine a case where the state government of North Carolina would say, yeah, we're gonna cede some of that
Yeah.
lawmaking authority back to the citizenry. That hasn't been a trend in recent years. It was very popular in the early 20th century, which is what led to a number of states getting the initiative. But we've not seen that in recent years. Remind me, do you remember what was the last state, not Mississippi, but what was the last state besides Mississippi to actually add it? Because we don't know that. Well, Mississippi's a whole different story. But what's the most recent state to actually add the initiative?
I was going to say Mississippi until you said, don't say Mississippi.
Well, now I cheated for you.
So now I don't.
Yeah. It's been a long time.
Let's pull it up.
Yeah. Luckily, there's a website for that.
Exactly.
It starts with Ballot and it ends with Pedia.
Illinois in 1970. But they have a very limited initiative
Extremely
process.
limited, right? Yeah.
Constitutional amendments in only certain subjects.
Yeah. So that's been a really long time since any of the states did that. So let's talk a little about the actual ballot measures in North Carolina that we have in our database. You can explore every single ballot measure in Ballotpedia from North Carolina that those North Carolinians have ever voted on. And some of those early measures dealt with things like segregation and disenfranchisement and literacy tests. So what do we learn about sort of the history of North Carolina from our review of their historical ballot measures?
Yeah, so like you said, our historical data dates back to 1835 when North Carolina first voted on a ballot question. And in the 19th century, voters decided on 21 measures. And those reflected, like you said, the debates going on in our country at the time: slavery, suffrage, segregation. Some notable measures to point out in that century: In 1865, there were two amendments, one outlawing slavery and involuntary servitude, except for punishment of a crime. That was approved. And then there was a second one that repealed the Ordinance for Secession and then also affirmed the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So just obviously vestiges of the Civil War. In 1876, North Carolina voters decided on a single ballot question that actually encompassed 30 different amendments to the state constitution, and this was a result of a constitutional convention in 1875. Those amendments included topics like prohibiting interracial marriage, requiring school segregation, removing the right to vote for persons convicted of felonies, and then there were also some like state governance-related things, establishing a Department of Agriculture. The question was approved with 53% of the vote. And I was kind of curious about kind of what was the discussion around this amendment, since it was one question but encompassed all of these different topics. So I searched newspapers.com, the archives, and some people were arguing like, approve it. If we don't approve it, we're going to have another convention and that'll just expend more state resources, kind of
Yeah.
getting to the logistical question of it.
Right.
Others argued that the amendments related, especially to state governments, would make the government more efficient, kind of ignoring the more social, divisive proposals within the amendment. And then others argue that the amendments forfeited rights that would be really hard to take back in the future if they were lost with the adoption of the amendment. So there's a kind of a wide array of, obviously given the amendment's wide array of subjects, how people were arguing for this. So that one was definitely interesting. And then at the turn of the century in 1900, North Carolina voters approved a literacy test. So you had to read or write any section of the Constitution to register to vote. And they also adopted a poll tax in the same year. Voters repealed the poll tax in 1920. And then interestingly enough, in 1970, when they voted on repealing the literacy test, which was already inoperative because of the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965,
Right.
voters defeated the amendment to repeal it by 56% of voters opposing it.
Yeah.
So it's still in the Constitution today.
Yeah. So you really get a window into sort of history when you read through Constitution, when you read through historical ballot measures. And side note, Frank was in my ear telling me North Carolina has not ever voted on establishing the initiative, along with pretty much most of the eastern seaboard states. We'll put the link in the show notes, but pretty much all of the states with the initiative are located west of Mississippi. There's a handful on the east coast, like Maine and Massachusetts and Florida. But most of the eastern seaboard states haven't ever actually considered a ballot measure to establish the initiative. So what other ballot measures, Victoria, stick out when we look through the voluminous database of North Carolina?
Yeah. We'll turn our attention to the 20th century. There were some pretty interesting ones, especially related to the governor's election. I thought this one was interesting. North Carolina was the last state to give the governor veto powers in 1996.
Good.
Yeah, kind of surprising.
Yeah.
In 1977, voters approved a constitutional amendment to allow the governor and lieutenant governors to run for 2 consecutive terms. Prior to that, they could only run for non-consecutive terms. And North Carolina is one of 37 states with a gubernatorial term limit. It just became 2 consecutive terms with that amendment. And then there's also been a few interesting ones related to tax and state budget. So since 1920, North Carolina has capped its income tax. At first, it was 6%. That increased to 10% in 1936, and then was reduced in 2018 to 7%. And then finally, in 1977, voters also approved a balanced budget requirement for the state. So just a fun little interesting.
That's interesting. So, I mean, that
amendments.
1977 era of having a number of interesting ballot measures come about. Now, this is sort of speculation, but would it tie in at all with the sort of what's considered the Prop 13 tax revolt of
I
the
wonder if
70s?
it.
I mean, it's kind of
I
hard to
would.
say because that was happening all the way out in California. That was mostly
Mhm.
initiative-led. But those did end up leading to a number of, state legislatures
Broader
taking
tax,
sort of
yeah.
similar broad tax sort of reforms and changes. And the timing seems coincidental.
Mhm. Definitely. I would be interested in reading some more of the like arguments in literature, kind of laying that out, how that may be connected.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so in the last few decades, has the ballot measure process played any major role shaping policy in North Carolina, or is it a bit more of a formality, or how's it sort of shaking out?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely not a formality, even though they don't have as many as some other states. Um, North Carolina has still voted on some pretty notable policies in recent elections, such as Marsy's Law, which is a list of crime victims' rights that they've added to their state constitution. They've also added the right to fish and hunt as two notable, like trendier rights that other states have adopted. We've also kind of touched on its purple nature. North Carolina has had a divided government for 15 of the last 33 years.
Mm.
So that's kind of played into the number of amendments put on the ballot and kind of the policies of those amendments. Um, Another thing I would want to point out is some of the litigation surrounding ballot measures. So in 2018, like I mentioned, that income tax cap, it
Yep.
decreased the income tax. There was also a voter ID amendment that was approved at the 2018 election. Both of those amendments were temporarily invalidated by the courts because it was found that the legislature that referred the amendments included districts that were unconstitutional racial gerrymanders, according to a federal court ruling. However, in 2023, after the North Carolina Supreme Court flipped partisanship from Democratic to Republican, the Supreme Court overruled those previous rulings, reinstating those amendments that had passed. So the income tax cap stands and the voter ID amendment stands as well.
And
Um,
amazing to see how that was years after voters approved those. They probably even
yeah,
forgot
20
what it was that they
yes.
voted on to begin with. So now all ballot measures are resolved quickly, we might say. Some may take
Yeah,
years to play out.
yes. Litigation takes many years. And also just looking ahead, the North Carolina legislature has already referred to the ballot for 2026 an additional photo ID requirement for all voters. So that 2018 amendment was only for voting in person, but this would apply to all voters. So the voters will decide on that in November 2026.
Right. And you didn't bring up one of the ballot measures. I'm going to lay this as a pop quiz on you. But in 2012, you may not remember this because you were not here at Ballotpedia, but I was here at Ballotpedia. In 2012, there was a very um, heavily followed ballot measure in North Carolina related to same-sex marriage that
Mm.
we remember it here well because it was one of our larger traffic moments in our early years because I think it was a May election, if memory serves.
Was it
So
the last marriage amendment before Obergefell then?
I want to say it was one of the last ones, yeah. And it was one of those times where um, we got traffic from really across the country because people around the country didn't understand what this measure was about. So there's a lot of intrigue and interest in reading about it and trying to learn about it, which, oftentimes I think what, we talk about on the ballot measures team, you and I and Ryan, is that we see today often voters feel like they don't need to read as much because they feel like they know what the issue is about. They already have made up
Mhm.
their mind. But back in 2012, in particular, with this issue, that was not the case. So, uh, 2012 North Carolina amendment, I think it was Amendment 1, and that one was I guess it's now in our historical database, so you can read more all about it
Yes.
there. But that's one that I remember pretty well from, gosh, a little more than a decade now. So,
Crazy.
any other North Carolina thoughts you want to share?
That's all I had for our listeners.
Well, we'll be back next month with another episode about historical ballot measures as we continue our journey, walking around the country, digging into all of the different statewide ballot measures that Americans have voted on. You can learn more about North Carolina and see our other episodes at the link in our show notes. We'll be back with another episode on the ballot in general sometime soon. So make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Geoff Pallay subbing in for Norm, and great to see you all. Thanks for listening.